Well, here we are. The sequel nobody wanted. Return of the camping ban. The Darwalls Strike Back. Bylaw Kerfuffle 2. I'm heading up to Stall Moor, a large and rather remote section of the South Moor, for a long walk and a camping trip. I'm hoping to do a bit of bird watching, picnic by a river, explore some prehistoric megaliths, and then cosy up in my tent and snooze under the stars. I'll probably not see another soul, and there'll be no sign I've even been there. Who could possibly object? Well, someone does, to the extent that an attempt to effectively ban camping is now being brought to the Supreme Court in the hope of quashing our access to outdoor adventures. I've got some questions. Who's responsible? What exactly do they want? Why are they doing it? And are they likely to succeed? Questions I will attempt to answer now. Welcome back to the Dartmoor podcast. Right, I've covered the basics of this before in 2 other videos, so I'll keep the setup as brief as possible as I walk up the River Erm from Ivybridge. For as long as anyone can remember, you've been able to camp out on Dartmoor. It's one of the things that makes it so special. It's the only place in England where you can legally go and camp without the landowner's permission. It's your right. That doesn't mean you can do whatever you like, though. There are some pretty comprehensive bylaws governing where, how and for how long you can camp. There's the camping map, showing in purple where you're permitted to set up your tent, and there are rules against lighting fires, making a mess, being a nuisance or getting in the way. They're pretty reasonable, and most people follow these rules. However, back in 2022, some landowners on the South Moor, the Darwalls, decided they didn't like this setup. Their lawyers nosed into the bylaws, found an oddly worded bit that was potentially ambiguous, and launched a legal attempt to clarify the rule. I covered this in a video at the time, and I'm rather proud that I immediately spotted the little phrase that would turn out to be the source of the problem. The public shall have a right to access the commons on foot or on horseback for the purpose of open-air recreation. Was camping open-air recreation? The Darwalls thought it wasn't. God knows, though, why I'd be heading out here on a cold February day if I didn't enjoy it. I made it to Hen Lake Down and the edge of the Darwalls' land. I've outlined on the map the area they own. It's about 4,000 acres, a big old patch of moor. And when they bought this land, back about a decade ago, they bought it under the knowledge that camping happened there. It was their land, but it was also a national park, and was, as such, governed by bylaws under the eye of the DNPA, the Dartmoor National Park Authority. Anyway, back in January 2022, the Darwalls' legal challenge succeeded. The judge decided that camping wasn't open-air recreation, and the repercussions were both more immediate and more wide-ranging than people expected. Because the courts had decided that the bylaw didn't allow camping on the Darwalls' land, then it didn't actually allow it anywhere on Dartmoor. People were absolutely furious. I made a second video covering the reaction. It demonstrates that, if anything, the Darwalls meddling with our rights was going to cause them far more fuss than a few campers staying on Stall Moor. Suddenly everyone was galvanised into action. People who had no interest in wild camping, let alone on the Darwalls' barren patch of Dartmoor, were stomping out in protest and making their voices heard. Around this time, the D to the N to the P to the A did an amazing job, scrabbling about, brokering deals with the landowners individually, and getting most of the camping map back online. Then, bloody legends, they appealed the verdict, and in a second court case reversed the decision and got things back to normal. And that's where I last left the issue. Well done, everyone. As you were. Time for a rest at Hanger Down Clump. This rather distinctive circle of tall old beech trees is the landmark I'd seen on the horizon for miles around, but never been up close to before. Look, here is the exact moment I fully realised I was on half-term holiday and didn't have to work for a week. Open-air recreation, hey? It's good stuff. But now, in 2024, the Darwalls have started work on the second Death Star. The case is going to the Supreme Court, and we're going to have to go through the anxiety of the potential camping ban all over again. And here's the thing I just can't get my head around. The thing that just doesn't make any sense. Why are they doing it? It must be costing them tens, if not hundreds of thousands of pounds to continue this squabble over the meaning of open-air recreation in the hopes of banning camping. And camping is already banned on most of their land, certainly all of it that's in any way accessible to the masses. And even on the bits where camping is allowed, it's already regulated. No fires, raves, satanic rituals, caravans, or anything else genuinely destructive. No, this only punishes the so-called wild campers, the least intrusive and problematic folks of the lot. In fact, the Darwalls specifically mention wild camping in the court cases as their source of worry. Which is odd. Wild camping, whether you like the name or not, has become an important term to distinguish between those who trek out with just a rucksack and leave no trace, and the tame campers who roll up in a motorhome, light a disposable barbecue, and leave all their rubbish everywhere. The amount of damage true wild campers do is negligible. And on top of that, there aren't even many wild campers out on this part of the moor. I'm the only one out here. And, ironically, I'm only here because I'm making a video about how they want to stop me being here. If anything, the Darwalls' repeated attempts to ban camping are having the opposite effect. If last year's 3,000-strong protest is anything to go by, their actions are actually popularising the idea of camping out here. It's all very bizarre. And here's another odd thing. New Waste. Terrible name. This used to be a popular spot to park your car, then head up onto the moor for a day of open-air recreation. But about a decade ago, the Darwalls locked the gate, making this whole section of the South Moor much more difficult to get to. If they don't want people camping out, maybe allowing them to park nearby and get back to their vehicles would be an idea. As it was already past midday, and I'd only just got onto the moor proper. In order to visit the things I wanted to, I'd have no choice but to camp out. It would be far too dangerous to try and navigate home in the dark. Not that that's a problem, I enjoy the camping out. It's certainly part of the recreation for me. My route would now take me north past Piles Copse, a place that has had its trouble with campers. Piles Copse, which lies on the other side of the River and is not on the Darwalls' land, used to be a lovely spot for a camping trip. It's one of Dartmoor's 3 stunted oak woodlands, and provides a beautiful Tolkien-esque grove where you can bathe in the river on a hot summer's day, or just laze in the shade of one of the gnarled trees. But sadly its beauty was its downfall. It became too popular, and some people camping in the woods, people who I wouldn't describe as true wild campers, didn't do so conscientiously. After some problems with mess, rubbish, damage to trees and fires, the landowners decided to put an end to it as a camping spot. It was never in the purple bit of the camping map anyway, so they were well within their rights, and you can see how a small, fragile environment like this needed to be protected and given time to recover. Stall Moor, on the other hand, on this side of the river, has no such problems. No large groups of campers, no fire pits, there's nothing to burn anyway, no mess, no rubbish, nothing. So why are the Darwalls so intent on stopping near non-existent camping on their lands? One theory, of which I was an early proponent, is that they want to use the land for hunting activities. From what little we know about the Darwalls, they're posh old duffers, and are into all that pheasant shooting, deer stalking, fox hunting psychopathy that the upper classes seem to enjoy so much. It could certainly be profitable for them, and they're no strangers to making money. But the more I think about this, I don't really see how a few wild campers would prevent them from getting on with it anyway, especially as presumably those activities would take place on their estate rather than the open commons up here. No, the more I think about it, it must be purely ideological. The capitalist conservatism of the landowner versus the libertarian anarchy of the wild camper. They spent plenty of money on their big swathe of moorland, and they just don't like the idea of someone else enjoying it. They have plenty more money where that came from, and don't mind slinging it at lawyers to get their way. Or maybe it's just something silly. Everyone is quick to blame hedge fund manager Alexander Darwall for it, but perhaps it's his wife Diana. Maybe she saw a YouTube video of some Dartmoor wild campers and it made her physically sick. "Oh, Alexander, it was horrible. Won't you keep those brutes away from me?" "Of course, Diana, darling. I'll protect you, whatever the cost." Anyway, whatever the reason, they hadn't gotten their way yet, and I was going to exercise my right to camp. I'd walked about as far as my little legs could carry me, and found a serene little spot beside the erm to set up my tent. I hadn't seen a single other person since Hanger Down, and felt, in this remotest of places, like the last person on earth. And there was a Neolithic treat waiting for me out here too, a prehistoric stone circle called the Dancers. A really, really beautiful spot, and significant too. The stone row that starts on the northern edge of the circle, Stalden Row, although not particularly impressive on first glance, is the longest in Europe, possibly the world, stretching as it does for 2 miles, down valleys, over rivers, through marshes and up hills. No one knows why, but the effort required to construct it implies it had great ritualistic significance. The row and circle, by the way, was in part restored by my Dartmoor hero, the Reverend Sabin Baron Gould. Here's a photo of him chilling here with some other Victorian gents after some amateur archaeology and open-air recreation back in the late 19th century. Why is the circle called the Dancers? Well, the story goes that some young maidens snuck out onto the moors one sunny Sunday to frolic about and have a dance. But they were discovered, and for the sin of cavorting on a Sunday, were turned to granite. Seems like a bit of an overreaction to me. And speaking of overreactions, let's return to the Darwalls and their expensive attempts to prevent a handful of people enjoying themselves. One thing that was bothering me was how the case had already had 2 completely opposite outcomes. The first judge ruling that camping wasn't permitted, and the second ruling that it was. To get the answer to these questions, I'd bought some light reading. The transcripts of both judgments. And after an evening reading through carefully, I think I've got a pretty decent grip on what happened and where the future decision will hinge. I'll try and explain with minimum waffle as I head homewards. Look, no mess at all. You'd have to be an expert tracker to know anyone had been here. Tin miners, on the other hand, they've trashed the place. So, let's start with the arguments that got camping banned back in 2022. Darwalls versus the DNPA. The case, as I've already mentioned, hinged on the interpretation of the phrase open-air recreation from Section 10 of the 1985 bylaws, and a lot of semantic quibbling about these words was to follow. There was also a backup question, giving the DNPA a second chance. If they could prove there was a custom of wild camping on the moor, then that would be good enough. The wording of the bylaw would become irrelevant. The Darwalls barrister laid down a number of arguments, some of which I'll summarise here. Firstly, he claimed open-air recreation simply meant a right to wander about off the footpaths, not camp. He uses the phrase jus spatiandi to mean wander about, which turned me against him immediately. He then argued that although some ancillary activities to your wandering about, like dog walking or picnicking, were included in your rights, camping wasn't, as no part of Dartmoor is more than 5 miles from the road, so you could always get home or go to a campsite. I wonder if he'd have felt the same if he'd joined me on my walk to the dancers. And then perhaps his most fruitful line of argument was that the camping sort of facilitated the recreation rather than being part of the recreation itself. He also tried some daft sixth form debate club arguments about tents blocking access and stuff, but we'll skip that nonsense. Then it was the DNPA's turn, and from reading between the lines here, it did not go well for their barrister, Mr. Leader. The report is filled with phrases like, did not pursue the issue with any great vigour orally, and his general submission was, etc., etc. I get the feeling that he didn't really formally submit his arguments properly, or maybe just that the judge didn't like him. The gist of his argument was that open-air recreation included camping, as long as people went about it in a civilised way, and that the reason for the bylaw being put in there was simply so that the DNPA could enforce it, taking the pressure off landowners to police their own acres, and making it easy for the DNPA, with the use of wardens, to consistently deal with anyone overstepping the boundaries. Basically, he said, stop worrying about it, Darwall, just let the DNPA deal with any nuisance campers. A refreshingly practical, common-sense statement, but not one that actually added anything much to the specific argument about the wording of the bylaw. Furthermore, he didn't follow through on the second question, whether there was a custom of wild camping, which should, in my opinion, have been easy to prove. The Chancellor of the High Court was not impressed. His verdict: camping is not open-air recreation, but a facility for its enjoyment, and that the open-air recreation they are engaging in is the hiking, not the camping. This, he said, was clear and unambiguous. This was the ruling that led to the protest here about a year ago. The impressive Stall down Stone Row. The second court case, the appeal, took place in July last year. The judge also said that the wording of the bylaw was clear and unambiguous, but the other way. Either these judges don't understand what ambiguous means, or something very weird is going on. What changed? Well, the DNPA's lawyers did for a start, and it seems that they pursued a much more direct argument. They simply drew attention to certain other sections of the 1985 bylaws that made it clear that camping was indeed part of your open-air recreational rights. For example, Section 6 actually says, "No person shall use any vehicle, including a caravan or any structure, other than a tent for the purpose of camping on access land." It also says that no one shall camp for more than 2 nights, or within 100 metres of the road, and that certain areas do not allow camping. Why would any of these additional rules around camping exist if camping wasn't allowed at all? Pretty watertight. And the judges agreed, saying that the previous judge's conclusion about camping not being ancillary to the open-air recreation was too narrow a way of looking at things, and that if it were the case, people would also need to ask permission to do anything from bird watching to dog walking to picnicking. There was no way of deciding which of these activities were ancillary and which weren't. They also commented on the purpose of the bylaws in creating a balance between the rights of us common folk and the rights of the landowners, and felt that this balance was currently just fine, thanks to the already existing camping rules enforced by the DNPA. My favourite statement came from the hobbity named Lord Justice Underhill, who said, "The question simply becomes whether wild camping, a modish phrase which I understand to mean camping overnight in a place which is not a dedicated campsite, falls within the definition of open-air recreation. In my opinion, it plainly does. Many people take pleasure in the experience of sleeping in a tent in open country, typically, though not invariably, as part of a wider experience of walking across country, and perhaps engaging in other open-air recreation such as birdwatching during the day. It is a perfectly natural use of language to describe that as a recreation, and also as occurring in the open air, notwithstanding that while the camper is actually in the tent, the outside air will be to some extent excluded." Mr. Underhill did, however, add one interesting point. Although the wording of the bylaw unambiguously favoured the DNPA, they sympathised with the landowner's plight, and said that some shocking examples of camping mess were submitted in the case. They even suggested that the DNPA look into further tightening up the rules. I'd be interested to see this shocking mess, as I have literally seen no problems out here at all. But, nonetheless, I see this statement as an important warning. Us campers need to be on our best behaviour if we want to keep our rights. At this point I bumped into a farmer and his helper. He was interested to hear where I'd been camping and showed no concern whatsoever about it, though he did say rather you than me when I described the ice on my tent that morning. It would seem that the workers out here on the Darwalls land have very little issue with us wild campers. The final stretch of my journey would take me back towards Hanger Down Clump, first passing through the Darwalls estate, with the footpath even taking me past their manor house. Will their case at the Supreme Court succeed? I have to say, I don't know. The fact that 2 different judges have unambiguously concluded 2 completely opposite things from the same sentence doesn't fill me with certainty. Even though I feel the DNPA has a much stronger argument, it could simply be a case of who the particular judge sympathises with most on the day. Or, worse still, it could come down to money. Is there a way the Darwalls could just outspend the DNPA until they can't afford to put forward a case anymore? I don't know enough about legal proceedings to answer that, but I've got a bad feeling about this. Anyway, as I made my way onto the last leg of my journey, I wondered about what the future would hold. The legal right to wild camp was on a knife edge again. I hope my little update has helped you understand just what's going on here. If you found it interesting, then I suggest you watch my other 2 videos on the topic too, as they cover it quite differently, not having the benefit of hindsight. If you have any extra information that I might have missed, or better still, any insight into what the Darwalls are hoping to achieve, then please leave a comment below so we can get some civilised discussion going. In the meantime, I'll keep exercising my right to open-air recreation with my fingers crossed. Thanks for listening, everyone. See you next time.